Welcome to Algorithmic Arguments, where ideas collide and insights ignite. Tonight, we're tackling a question that's on every pop culture enthusiast's mind. Is the Marvel Cinematic Universe's expansion into spin-offs diluting the value of its core franchise? We've assembled an eclectic panel of experts who will dissect this issue from unique angles. Joining me are Mayor Dolores, Dolly, Hutchins, with her no-nonsense approach to governance and resource management, Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose expertise in cultural anthropology might just reveal some surprising parallels between ancient civilizations and modern fandom, Priya, Sundaram, a software engineer who's likely to debug the business strategy behind Marvel's expansion, and Thornton III, a tech entrepreneur with a keen eye for disruption and innovation. Over the next hour, we'll scrutinize the impact of spin-offs on franchise value, challenge assumptions, and maybe even uncover some unexpected truths. Let's dive in.
Well now, I'm not one for comic books or superheroes myself, but I do know a thing or two about community and branding. In my experience, and I've got plenty, when you spread yourself too thin, you risk losing focus. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has certainly made a lot of movies, and while it's brought in a lot of revenue, I'm not so sure it's all sunshine and rainbows. With so many spin-offs, it seems to me that the core story might get lost on folks. Now, I know some people will say that's just part of growing and evolving, but as someone who's had to balance budgets and make tough decisions for this town, I've learned that sometimes less is more. If you ask me, Marvel needs to be careful not to overextend itself. After all, too many cooks in the kitchen can spoil the stew.
Let's examine this through the lens of first principles thinking. When Disney acquired Marvel, the strategic thesis was to leverage the IP and create a vast ecosystem. Now, with numerous spin-offs like Loki and Hawkeye, some argue is diluting the core franchise value. Thornton III would counter that by saying we're not just talking about movies. We're witnessing an evolution of storytelling paradigms. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has always been ahead of the curve. Remember when comic books were niche? They pioneered transmedia storytelling, turning characters into cultural phenomena. By expanding into spin-offs, they're capturing more audience segments and creating a flywheel effect that increases brand loyalty and value. It's not dilution, it's strategic market saturation. Consider Netflix's playbook. By churning out content at scale, they condition consumers to crave constant novelty. Marvel's playing the same game, but with higher stakes. They're constructing an experiential universe that's becoming indispensable to modern entertainment.
Thornton III's assertion that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is capturing more audience segments through spin-offs may overlook potential cannibalization of core franchise viewership.
Actually, I think Rick's assertion that MCU spin-offs are capturing more audience segments oversimplifies the issue. It's a classic case of optimizing for metrics rather than quality. The data on Disney Plus subscriptions and viewership numbers might look good in isolation, but we need to consider cannibalization effects. For instance, with multiple spin-offs like Loki and Hawkeye, there's a risk that enthusiasm for these shows might displace interest in the core films. That's not necessarily about capturing new segments, but rather fragmenting an existing fanbase across more titles. Consider it akin to adding features to software. If you overload users with too many options, each one gets less valuable. At some point, feature creep dilutes overall value. The real question is whether Marvel's pursuit of growth through sheer volume can maintain the perceived scarcity and thus the allure that made its core franchise successful in the first place.
Let's focus on quantifying the impact of these spin-offs. What metrics should we use to assess their effect on the core franchise's value?
I'd like to approach this question with a healthy dose of skepticism, much like I do when evaluating archaeological findings. When assessing the impact of spin-offs on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we must consider the evidence. The data suggests that expansion can indeed have both positive and negative effects. On one hand, spin-offs like Loki and Hawkeye have garnered critical acclaim and attracted new audiences. However, there's a risk of oversaturation, diluting the core franchise's value. Consider the concept of stratigraphic integrity in archaeology. As layers are added, the original context can become muddled. Similarly, if Marvel prioritizes quantity over quality in its spin-offs, it may compromise the essence of the core franchise. We must examine the evidence and weigh the pros and cons before making a conclusion.
As we pivot into the next round, I want to highlight Dr. Vasquez's astute observation that the MCU's strategic use of Disney Plus has altered the traditional theatrical release model, effectively creating a new paradigm for franchise storytelling. This bold move raises questions about the value proposition of core films versus spin-offs. What's coming next? Our panelists will dive deeper into the economics of this strategy and its impact on fan engagement. If you're enjoying these insights, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when our experts dissect the role of nostalgia in sustaining franchise loyalty.
Actually, I think Rex underestimates the risk of creative dilution. Merely having data on consumer behavior doesn't mitigate that concern. While Disney can monitor dynamics closely through their analytics, it doesn't necessarily address whether these efforts yield diminishing returns in terms of cultural impact or perceived value over time. The issue isn't just about cannibalization but also saturation. Too many titles might lead to fatigue rather than engagement. Consider software development. When a project grows organically without clear architectural vision, maintainability suffers. Similarly, if Marvel prioritizes quantity over cohesion across their franchise, that may dilute its core appeal regardless of raw viewership numbers or subscription metrics. We should examine whether there's an optimal feature set for the MCU, beyond which additional titles diminish overall value rather than enhance it.
Priya, your analogy about software development, while insightful, slightly misapplies to the MCU's situation. Their franchise model isn't akin to a singular project's maintainability but rather a portfolio of interconnected IPs.
I must say, that's actually a really interesting question about Disney Plus subscription churn rates. It's a metric that warrants examination. Let me push back on the notion that creative dilution is an inevitable outcome. When I was at Stanford, though I didn't finish, of course, I studied some compelling research on platform ecosystems and how they scale value through expanded offerings. The Marvel Cinematic Universe isn't just creating spin-offs for their own sake. They're architecting a meta-narrative that's redefining entertainment paradigms. Take Loki, which deconstructed traditional villainy while injecting new life into the franchise. By leveraging Disney Plus, Marvel can maintain an always-on engagement loop with fans, actually increasing brand affinity and reducing churn, provided they continue producing high-quality content that resonates. So we must consider not just dilution, but also how effectively they're converting these additional touchpoints into sustained ecosystem value, a far more nuanced discussion than simply counting viewers or films.
Let's focus on quantifying the impact of spin-offs. We need concrete data to support or refute these dilution concerns.
Well now, let's get down to business, folks. In my experience, and I've got plenty, when you spread yourself too thin, you risk losing focus on what truly matters. The Marvel Cinematic Universe's core franchise has been built on a foundation of quality storytelling and character development. I'm not convinced that expanding into spin-offs isn't watering down the magic, if you will. It's like trying to harvest what you haven't planted, it just doesn't work. Now, I appreciate Rex's point about leveraging IP, but let's keep an eye on what's core to our community, in this case, the fans of Marvel movies. Are they truly engaged with these spin-offs, or are we just seeing metrics-driven decisions that might not translate to long-term loyalty? We need to consider whether these spin-offs are cannibalizing the core franchise's value. I'll tell you one thing, we'll figure it out, we always do.
As we conclude this debate, I'd like to synthesize the key points and reflect on what I've learned. My colleagues have raised valid concerns about the potential dilution of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's core franchise value through spin-offs. I agree that expansion can have both positive and negative impacts, requiring an evidence-based assessment. The data we've discussed, box office performance, critical reception, and audience engagement metrics, suggest a nuanced picture. While some spin-offs like Loki and Hawkeye have performed well, we must consider the cannibalization of core franchise viewership and the risk of oversaturation. I'd argue that the jury is still out. We need to examine year-over-year changes in viewership for core films versus their preceding or related spin-offs. Ultimately, it's crucial to prioritize quality over quantity and maintain focus on what resonates with audiences. By doing so, Marvel can mitigate dilution and ensure a robust franchise.
Actually, I'd like to challenge the assumption that spin-offs are inherently dilutive. As an engineer, I'm trained to look for data-driven insights. Let's examine year-over-year changes in viewership for core films versus their preceding or related spin-offs. For instance, Loki and Hawkeye did exceptionally well on Disney+, but what impact did they have on the box office performance of subsequent core films? I'd argue that optimizing for metrics like subscriptions and viewership might be short-sighted if it comes at the cost of quality and audience fatigue. We need to consider cannibalization effects, not just correlation with revenue growth. If fans are spreading themselves too thin across multiple series and movies, that's a feature, not a bug. It's a sign that Marvel needs to reassess its content strategy to maintain franchise health.
As we conclude this debate, let's revisit the strategic thesis at play here, leveraging IP to create a vast ecosystem. My argument has been that spin-offs like Loki and Hawkeye may indeed dilute the core franchise value, but not in the way critics assume. It's not about spreading too thin. It's about understanding the underlying drivers, fan engagement, brand affinity, and revenue growth. I've heard valid concerns about cannibalization and optimization for metrics over quality, but we mustn't conflate correlation with causation. The data on subscriptions and viewership is promising, yet I'd caution against drawing conclusions without examining year-over-year changes in viewership for core films versus their preceding spin-offs. What I've learned from this discussion is that a nuanced approach is necessary, one that considers both the positive and negative impacts of expansion. In closing, I firmly believe that Marvel's ecosystem strategy will ultimately enhance its core franchise value, but only if executed with a deep understanding of fan engagement and brand affinity. As we close out today's episode of Algorithmic Arguments, let's distill the essence of our debate on the Marvel Cinematic Universe's strategic expansion through spin-offs. The crux of the matter revolves around whether this diversification is eroding the allure of its flagship franchise. Priya, Pree, Sundaram convincingly argued that the dilution effect stems not from the proliferation of spin-offs per se, but from a perceived homogeneity in storytelling and character development across these extensions. She posited that narrative cohesion, what she termed emotional resonance, is what truly fortifies brand loyalty. Indeed, Pree's emphasis on maintaining this emotional core amidst franchise sprawl resonated strongly with our audience, securing her the top spot tonight. Dr. Vasquez offered compelling counterpoints regarding market saturation and consumer fatigue, but it was Pree who adeptly navigated these challenges while reinforcing her thesis. To all our panelists, Pree, Elena, Rex, and Dolly, I extend my sincerest gratitude for injecting such vibrancy into this discussion. Your insights not only sharpened our understanding, but also sparked a lively exchange that kept our viewers engaged. And to you, our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you're as enthralled by the intersection of pop culture and critical thought as I am, please do hit that subscribe button and join us next time on Algorithmic Arguments. Your support means the world. Let's keep this intellectual odyssey going. Until then, stay curious.